Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bill Chopik, one of our illustrious graduates from the University of Michigan. So as many of you know, Bill received his PhD here in 2015, and he then left us to go to Michigan State University, where he is a tenured associate professor. Oh, and I should mention he worked with me. Oh, yeah. He did work with me in the personality and social context area and with actually many of the people, some of the people in this room. I saw Jackie and Shinobu as well. Bill has won most every award that you can imagine. 2 early career awards from relationships research. Oh, I should mention his work is focused on romantic relationships and personality development. He won the SAGE Early Career Award from the Society for Personality and Psychology. So I am very proud of his many accomplishments. And I'll just mention his trajectory has also been very impressive. He has an H index of 54, which is, yeah, quite. I stopped counting his publications a while ago. It just gets too depressing, but I think it's somewhere around around 100 or so, or maybe it was 100 since he left. It's It's
depressing for me too.
Okay. All right, so I am very excited to introduce Bill and have him give his talk on optimism and health, resource, or delusion.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for coming, everybody. Goose. Yeah, sure. Okay, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Thanks. Thank you. Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it, and it's such an honor coming back to school here. I already screwed this up. I'm sorry. Exit. That's what I did. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. It's such an honor to be here, and I have such a great deal of affection for Michigan, and it's really great kind of walking the campus today with Dave and seeing all the really great old places. Robin was so nice to introduce me at a conference recently, and it took me down memory lane, and I was going through some old photos, and I found this really wonderful one of me and my friend Ed O'Brien, who's a social psychologist at Booth Business School. And the really funny thing about this picture is it really captured the vibes of my time here. Namely, it was a really fun experience full of really wonderful people. Actually, so much so that the department would often use this as a photo to show how happy graduate students were, to show, oh, you should go to grad school here. Or, look how smiley these white people are. I don't know. Okay, so they're like, oh, this will certainly attract people. But the really funny thing is that this actually isn't the full photo, because if you crop out the photo, you see that there's a little bit more. Namely, we're waiting for free food and drink, which, if there's grad students in the room, I'm sure you can kind of identify with. That's one of the things. Michigan would doctor a photo for promotional purposes. That's still, who'd never do that, Dave? Michigan State University would never do that. We don't even have a PR department, which that's not good either. So just thanks so much for having me today. Like Robin mentioned, I study how close relationships and the people in them change over time across situations. So we have some work looking at how you approach relationships differs based on where you grew up, where you live, maybe the time in human history that you were born, how that kind of shapes your experiences. We also have some work on relationship context, mostly the people that you're married to or that you're friends with. How does that shape how happy and healthy you are, the foolish things you do, the wonderful things you do? We also have some work on individual differences and how your personality and other psychological characteristics change over time. And then finally, we do look at some neuroendocrine functioning, mostly in collaboration with Robin from my grad school days. And we look at these experiences from your earliest relationships to some of your final ones during your life. But today is all about optimism, and all of you know at least a little bit of what optimism is. It's the expectation that good things will happen to you in the future and that they'll be plentiful. The interesting thing is that a lot of you probably have an intuition of optimism and kind of how it changes, maybe how you've changed as a person. I will say that there's tons of literary and historical examples as well. So Voltaire's Candide, I think it's over 400 years old, tells the story of a relatively naive person, Voltaire, who has a mentor who promises that this is the best of all possible worlds. And the unfortunate thing is actually the book is an extremely depressing book. Namely, he starts out kind of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed about the world, and then a bunch of really horrible things befall Voltaire. Namely, he loses the love of his life 3 times, she's resurrected, and then he loses her again. That same mentor who thought it's the best of all possible worlds develops boils. By the end of the book, the main takeaway is them tilling in a garden saying, maybe let's just stick to the garden in front of us and not think about otherworldly things or the future. That's the message of that book, is maybe don't think too positively about the future. Likewise, this person on the right is Pollyanna. So if you've ever heard the term Pollyanna-ish, it's based on a book, play, musical. Even that's a really depressing story, despite the origin. Sorry, this is not an uplifting talk, so just get it out of the way right away. Pollyanna has the glad rule, where she looks at the bright side of everything. Oh, we need it to rain, otherwise how will the flowers bloom? Pollyanna has a terrible fall and loses the ability to walk. And then by the end of the book, Pollyanna says, well, wasn't it so wonderful that I was able to walk in the first place? That's the story of Pollyanna. If these stories aren't old enough for you, there's also the book of Job, namely a test between God and Satan to test the will of a follower. Namely, Job always thinks positively that the Lord has his best interest, despite a lot of terrible things befalling him. That's the story of perpetual optimism in the face of really terrible things. I will say, if you're a movie fan or just general culture, you also see this in a lot of different types of media. So major blockbusters, not this one, I'm talking about this one, obviously. If you haven't seen Barbie 8 times like me, she starts out really bright-eyed about the world, and then I'm losing the exact line, but starts to realize that mortality, that we're all going to die someday, and comes to terms with what the real world is like, what men are like. And then by the end, she kind of develops this new perspective on the world that is a little bit more balanced in life experience. So that basic story, that we start out really naive, life challenges us, and then we kind of have on balance this new perspective on life. You see that everywhere. You see that Frodo trying to destroy the ring. You see that with rom-coms. You see that with so many other kind of narratives that we hold in the literature. And this is a lot of what today's going to be about, is whether or not that narrative is true and whether or not it makes sense. So a lot of you are probably thinking about optimism, and you might think, are optimistic people delusional? And especially when you talk to an academic audience, which might lean a little bit pessimistic, you might view optimists as this kind of toxically positive group of people. Maybe they're a little bit divorced from reality. But the truth is, when you look at, say, their performance on cognitive tasks or their ability to attend to factual things in the environment, optimists are actually, on average, performing better at a lot of those tasks. So it's not like they're totally foolish about the world, foolish about their environments, foolish about their lives. But in general, I'm going to have 2 slides of definitions, and I'll kind of get into it. So optimism, the way I think about it, is comprised of 2 dimensions, namely the ability to perceive and emphasize positive things. So you have to be able to see what's positive and what's negative. And the other is to expect more of those things in the future. So really, really basic definitions. But from this basic definition, there's actually a lot of different operationalizations of what optimism is. So today I'll be mostly talking about a dispositional approach. We measure these via self-report. So and uncertain times, I usually expect the best. You would kind of agree or disagree with this. There's also even more simpler ones, like on average, I'm an optimist. That's a basic measure. There's also forecasts measures where they'll say, hey, here's a stock. What's the return that you think it'll yield? So the idea is that if you predict higher yields, that's more optimism. There's literature in gerontology where they'll ask, how long do you think you'll live? So that's a darker measure of optimism, where people say longer years. That's maybe makes them more optimistic. But there's also a bunch of different measures. So there's this subfield called unrealistic optimism. And that's what they'll do is they'll ask you just before you're evaluated in some way. So think of yourself as a college student, you're about to take a test. They'll say, how well do you think you'll do on this test? Or how well did you think you did on the test? And what they'll do is they'll compare it to the actual grade you got. And they'll basically subtract those two. And that's kind of how far off you are or how unrealistically optimistic you are. But there's a bunch of other things too, like objective performance. There's also specific optimism. So you could be optimistic about, say, academic contexts, but really pessimistic about romantic ones. So there's also kind of domain specific optimism too. So the really interesting thing is that, when you ask people if they're optimistic and if good things will happen in the future, the really surprising and befuddling thing is that good things actually happen to these people. So, they'll say that they expect the best, and then they're more likely to finish school with a higher GPA. There's a study from the 1980s showing that the more optimistic politician tends to win. Maybe we should redo some of these studies. Higher kind of pressure performances like sports. Optimists are more likely to get jobs, get higher salaries, and be promoted faster, possibly because they apply for the promotions because they think it might actually work out. And likewise, one thing that we'll talk a lot about today is optimists and close relationships. Namely, optimists think that they have better relationships. And I was very careful the way I said that. I said they think they have good relationships, because they'll do these really funny studies where they're called support provision studies, where they'll kind of do an EMA study where they ask throughout the day, like, hey, how supportive is your partner? What did they do for you? And optimists are like, oh, they're so great. They asked how my day was. They made me coffee. They took me shopping. They fed the dog. And then they'll ask their partner, hey, what are all the nice things you did for your partner? And the partner will be like, I have no idea what they're talking about. So optimists sort of manufacture this perception of support. And it turns out that they benefit from that, even if it's not necessarily true. And that's going to be a running theme today, too, is believing that good things are possible, even if there's evidence to suggest otherwise. So there's all these kind of good things that happen to optimists. And one thing we'll talk about today is why it's good for their health. So if you just measure how good people feel, like rating their subjective health, 40 years in the future, optimists have higher self-rated health. They have lower mortality, so they don't die as young as pessimists. They have lower rates of hospitalization, and once they have surgery, they have fewer complications. They have use fewer sick days. When they have lower hospital visits, but they have higher preventative hospital visits. So they're more likely to, say, go to the doctor when they have a sinus infection right away than, say, find themselves in a health emergency. They are less likely to have stroke, less likely to have heart disease. They have better pulmonary functioning. So if you know that test where you blow air into a tube to keep a ball afloat, optimists have stronger lungs. And they have less cardiovascular and pulmonary disease. They report less subjective pain experiences. When they do fall, which is a huge consideration when you're older, they're more likely to recover from those falls, which can be really devastating when you're older adult. So it's not like optimists have superpowers or anything. They're actually doing stuff that makes them healthier. Namely, they exercise more, they smoke less. If they start smoking, they're more likely to quit smoking over time than pessimists. They have higher health literacy. They just know stuff about their bodies and why it hurts and what to take to make it stop hurting. They have healthier diets. So if you're familiar with the Mediterranean diet, those are overrepresented with optimists eating kind of nuts and healthy oils and fruits. And the mechanisms, at least our current understanding, is that they tend to set achievable goals where it's not like they kind of just perpetually follow stuff ignorant of the context and consequences, but they're actually pretty nimble at kind of giving up on unattainable stuff and pivoting to stuff that they can actually achieve. And it really does boil down to the sense that the feeling that they have a control over their environment, or a perceived mastery, control. You can call it a few different things. Basically, they think that they have control over their environments. And it's all these people who just expect good things to happen to them, and then they kind of make that a reality. So that's the current understanding in the literature, is that optimists think that there's positive things in the future and that they have the power to make that happen. But the interesting thing, and what I kind of want to broach today, is whether or not that always makes sense. To think you have control over your environments when, admittedly, a bunch of life is random and you can't always avoid the terrible things that befall you. Likewise, a lot of really wonderful and happy things that should fill your life with joy should presumably change your optimism too, because maybe that experience of a positive thing might lead you to expect more positive stuff in the future. But in a way, when we look at why and how optimism changes, the results are sometimes overwhelming, and it ultimately comes down to people's perceptions of things that happen to them. So the thing that happens to pessimists is they could have all these really wonderful things happen to them, but there's this phrase that people find the silver lining in every cloud, or the cloud in every silver lining. And it's the idea that our perceptions do drive a lot of what we experience in life. So one thing I want to kind of start out is making the case that one way we can kind of figure out if optimism is a good or a bad thing, or is rooted in your life experiences, is in part to measure how it changes over the course of your life. So in a way, we're going to be studying Pollyanna or Candide or Job, kind of as they live life, as good and bad things happen to them, to see if their perspectives on the world change. So how does optimism change across the lifespan? Well, there's a few different theories that would kind of make predictions. So one, if you're a social psychologist, maybe you're familiar with self-determination theory. It's the idea that, throughout life, you kind of navigate towards goals related to competence and autonomy and relatedness. And the idea is that as you live your life, you just get better at stuff. So if you remember, kind of think about your job now and how difficult it was when you first started, and now it's a cakewalk. I remember when I was in grad school here, every seemingly minor thing was a catastrophe, or was filled with stress, imbued with so much seriousness. And then by the time you're a fifth year, you kind of just don't care about a lot of these minute things that happen to you. So there's a sense in which you just build competence over time. You become an autonomous, competent person. So one way to expect positive things is that you kind of just get experience, and you, sorry for the French, you just suck less at stuff. So then you kind of get better at things, and then you might as well experience positive things. Likewise, there's also lifespan theories about how your goals shift as you start to realize that life is short. So namely, as kind of the horizon of life becomes more and more close to you, you start to kind of shift your goals away from things that are more information or status related. So if you think of when you were young, a lot of life was about getting ahead, forming this connection, working in this lab, getting into this grad school. But then as you get older, there's this shift that happens where you start to focus on stuff that might bring you emotional balance, make you happier. Maybe you're less likely to go to that networking event and more likely to, say, have dinner with a friend or read a book at home. So this is called socio-emotional selectivity theory. There's also accompanying vulnerability adaptation models. Here's kind of a visual representation of it. So this dashed line along the top, this is how much information seeking goals people engage in. So it tends to peak when you're relatively young, like an adolescent or early adult. And then kind of over time, those goals are replaced by more emotion regulation related stuff. So things like maintaining emotional balance, seeking out opportunities, avoiding negative stimuli. There's a lot of studies just based on tracking people's attention towards things. So based on these theories, we wanted to start out by just doing a really, really broad descriptive study about what optimism looks like at different ages. So that's why this first study here had 4.5 million people from 88 different countries all around the world. So they filled out a character strengths-based measure of optimism. And the really interesting thing when you have data this large, each of these countries had at least 1,000 people in it. So one thing you can actually do is reproduce a lot of what we see in kind of cultural and regional differences. So one thing is that, people in Western cultures tend to give really kind of intensely positive ratings of things when you ask them how happy they are, how joyful they are, how surprised they are, how depressed they are. There's a sense in which there is this kind of overwhelming positivity thing where Americans predominantly will give these really intense emotional responses to these items. One thing you'll see though is around, say, Eastern Europe, Russia, you'll see that they're less optimistic. Sorry, the more optimistic countries are more red, yellow is less. And one thing that we'll do is we'll actually zoom in on a lot of those regions later in the talk, because we have some within country data where you can see kind of some historical patterns as well. So, we did find these cultural differences on average, where these Western cultures tend to get more positive, kind of intensely positive ratings. But then actually, when you look at how optimism differs by age, it's remarkably consistent across cultures. And where you'll see that actually the people who are lowest in optimists are actually the young adults. It's the Pollyanna, it's the Job, it's the Candide at the start of the story. And actually the more optimistic people are those in middle-aged and older adulthood. So it's actually, this should at least violate a little bit of your intuition, because it's not like the Barbie story where, she starts out wildly optimistic and then life happens. It's actually the opposite, where, younger people are the least optimistic. And then again, we think that maybe you build competency, you start to shift your goals to be more emotionally balanced. So it's actually the people kind of in middle-aged and older adulthood that tend to be more optimistic than the younger adults. So the problem with this, though, is that it's cross-sectional. So when you only capture people at one time point, the issue is that there might be some special, what's called a cohort effect, where there may be some special circumstances into which these people are born. So maybe, stop me if you've heard this before, maybe younger adults were born into such a period in time or socialized that they're wildly pessimistic, on TikTok all day, narcissistic, sad about the future. And then maybe, say, baby boomers were born into this, period of affluence. You can make a lot of different stories and blame the youth for every problem these days, but there's a sense in which what you really want is longitudinal data, where you can, say, follow people, as cohorts over time. So what we tried to do with that was this second study, where we combined a bunch of different data from a bunch of different longitudinal studies. And this one used a measure of optimism from what's called a Q-sort, which I'm happy to talk a little bit about. It's kind of this a little bit older measure that a lot of developmental psychologists still use. But a woman named Eva Clonin made a measure of optimism. And what we did is we kind of used this measure of optimism to go into a lot of historic data sets to follow people over time. So these are what those data sets are. So one thing is, across the top, these are the names of the data sets. And then in parentheses is when those people were born. And then along the left are the ages at the waves. And then the numbers in the cells are the number of participants at each wave. And if you add those across, you get the number in the rightmost column. And that's the sample size at each particular wave. So the really cool thing about kind of merging a bunch of different data sets together is that you can start to look at the role of context and the conditions in which people were born. So for example, there's a famous study called the Block and Block longitudinal study. As people were born in 1969, means they were probably in college around, say, the late 80s, early 90s, when there was kind of a major technological boom. They were during a recession as well, the H.W. Bush years. These middle three studies I find the most fascinating. So these are the Berkeley Guidance and Berkeley Growth studies. You'll see that they were born in 1929, which of course was the onset of the Great Depression in the United States. So these people were born during the Great Depression, but then the Oakland growth sample were born in 1923. So the Depression hit them kind of a little bit deeper into childhood. They weren't born into a depression, but they were kind of, their early childhood years were kind of in the 20s, which was actually a good economic time. The interesting thing, though, is that the people born during the Great Depression, they were unfortunately born during the Great Depression, but actually they were just young enough to avoid being drafted into World War II. However, the Oakland sample was just old enough to be sent off to war. So it's not like they totally escaped kind of the historical circumstances. So when you think of things like optimism, you might think, hey, being born into a depression might kind of give you a scarcity mindset. Being sent off to war with heavy casualties, a world war, might make you think differently about the future and how long you live and kind of what you can look forward to. The Mills and Radcliffe samples, this is of Abby Stewart fame and of Oliver John and Ravenna Helson. These were studies of college women. A lot of times these women were the first in their families to go to college, kind of as large amounts of women started pursuing higher education. So each of these studies kind of have their own unique kind of historical setting that might affect their optimism. So the cool thing about merging all these different data sets is that you can pool them in a really creative way where you can kind of combine the data to estimate something like how does optimism change from age 7 to age 77, kind of pooled across the data. But then you have this cohort sequential component where you have the study or the lives kind of starting and stopping at different points in history. So, what is the trajectory of people's optimism if they were born during the Great Depression, or if they were sent off to World War II, or if they were the first in their family to go to college, or the first time anyone's used a computer in their family. We also have different people at the same ages, but born 40 years apart. So you could actually kind of reproduce what optimism looks like at the same age, but among very, very different historical contexts. So I wasted all your time saying that, and actually across all of these studies, everybody increased in optimism over time. So the different colors are of the different samples. Some cohorts are a little bit more dramatic than others, but basically there's not any of the cohorts that didn't increase in optimism, regardless of being born in the Great Depression, going off to World War II, being the first in your family to pursue higher education. Okay, so optimism appears to increase across the lifespan, at least according to this cross-sectional, cross-cultural data and this longitudinal data from different cohorts. It's consistent with a lot of these theories, namely you get better at stuff and you start to shift to be more emotionally balanced. However, it also appears that optimism might taper off because if you look kind of closely at these graphs and you look at the tail end towards the end of the lifespan, you see that it's not this uniform increase where kind of optimism keeps going up. There is a sense in which it kind of reached an asymptote or a plateau where it kind of flattens out. And there's actually literature on this particular part of people's lives too. And it starts to challenge the idea that optimism kind of just keeps going up in one direction. And leave it to psychologists to choose really inspiring terms. So this phenomenon is called terminal decline. And they do this really fascinating methodological thing, and Dennis Gershoff is just one of the people that does this, where they'll essentially wait until everybody in a data set passes away. And then instead of just looking at how people change over time, what they'll do is they'll just look, hey, how did you change in the last 3 years just before you passed away? And you'll see that there's these really precipitous declines in people's well-being. It's often linked to their health because they're actively dying. So this is not quite from those studies, but you do see this kind of decline in subjective well-being towards the end of life that might signal this terminal decline. Again, we're really great at names as social psychologists. There's also a phenomenon called sobering up theory. And this is the Candide, Pollyanna kind of idea that, you're all optimistic about the world, but then kind of reality hits. So that work is by Kate Sweeney, and she points out that maybe optimism has this kind of darker point where it sets people up for disappointment later. And there's an idea that both of these phenomena might have implications for looking at optimism at that very kind of tail end in late life, older adults. So optimism, does it decline in these last few years? And is it related to, say, how people's health is changing? So what we did is we gathered data from the Health and Retirement Study, the best study at ISR at University of Michigan. Jackie's nodding. Oh, okay, all right. I won't put you on the spot. So yeah, it's a nationally represented study of older adults. And in their psychosocial module, they included measures of optimism every wave, so you can actually track how people changed over time. In this particular study, it was done at a time when we only had 2 waves, but I'll give you some data later. And we also assessed their self-rated health and chronic illnesses. And one thing you can do with really, really dense data like this is that you can track the exact age and part of a person's life where they stop becoming more optimistic and start becoming more pessimistic. And that age is around 68 to 70. That's kind of this inflection point where all of a sudden they stop increasing, they start decreasing. Here's that information plotted a slightly different way. So this is what's called the latent slope. So when this yellow line is above 0, it means you're increasing. When it's below, it means that you're decreasing. And you'll see that when people are, most of their kind of middle-aged and older adulthood life, they're increasing. And then there is this crossover where the increases go down and then all of a sudden it's negative. And it kind of is the worst around age 85. And then this really fascinating thing happens all the way to the right, where among people who survive to age 95, they are loving life and they're full of optimism. So, if you've worked any with this type of data, there's a sense in which the people who survive and stay in a study are a little bit different than the people who kind of start a study. So, you can actually see that as this weird methodological thing that happens where if you are healthy enough to survive to an advanced age, you are doing well in a lot of different domains, including what you think about the future. Okay, so optimism tends to increase until about age 68 or 70 before it declines. However, there was a lot of what are called individual differences. So some people kept becoming more optimistic, some people were relatively stable, some people declined. One thing is that it was correlated with how healthy you felt and the onset of chronic illnesses. So if you got diagnosed with, say, arthritis or diabetes or had a heart attack or a stroke, those kind of were correlated with how much you changed in optimism. Namely, you became more pessimistic if you had a heart attack, things like that. Yep, and this was also true across different socioeconomic groups. So there's a sense in which optimism was correlated with good things across the socioeconomic spectrum, across different racial ethnic groups, across different geographic regions. But yeah, so you might be wondering, well, why does optimism change? I gave you these kind of theoretical stories about why that might be the case. Namely, you get better at stuff, you get sicker, you shift your goals to be more kind of emotionally balanced. One obvious thing you might ask, well, maybe it depends on stuff that happens to me, because that's what all these stories and movies that you've seen your whole life have been telling you, is that when good and bad things happen to you, you tend to change your worldview. And it does kind of go into this broader literature where there's this temptation to kind of see movies like Barbie or read books like Candide or Pollyanna and think that, you know, adversity is this natural part of life that forces us to grow in ways. I'm sure you can think of all sorts of points in your life where you went through something really difficult, but then you came out on the other side with a new perspective, or you know, now I know how to trust people that do this, or now I know to never date that type of person, or now I know to never, I don't know, stay out past 2 a.m. I don't know. There's all these things you learn over the course of your life with the idea that maybe you grow in some way. But, you know, the really interesting thing is that it looks like we don't tend to find that with both good or bad events. So in this particular study, we followed over 30,000 people from the Netherlands, Germany, and the United States. And these are all life events along the left-hand side. And then this is a forest plot, so there's a 0 line in the middle. And when the confidence interval crosses 0, it means it's not significant. So across all of these life events in 3 different countries and 30,000 people, there wasn't a single life event that replicated that would explain why you become more pessimistic or optimistic. And, you know, some of these are really, really intense. It's you losing your job. It's your partner passing away. It's you getting married. It's you having a child. It's your child passing away. It's you moving out of your childhood home for the first time. You know, these are really, really significant life events in people's lives. And it looks like their thoughts about the future, both good and bad, don't tend to be changing much on average. And it does get to, again, this point that people are stubbornly optimistic or pessimistic. So the truth is, you know, on average, for the most part, I think most people would say that marriage is an ostensibly positive experience. But, you know, I'm sure you can encounter either yourself or tons of your friends that maybe they also label it as a pretty nerve-wracking event, or they were nervous about their life after marriage, or they were nervous about the ceremony. Or same thing with having kids. That's a very ambivalent experience. I'm sure maybe that's a lot of you can kind of tell that as well. And the idea is that, you know, pessimists will find a way to ruin every positive event, and optimists will also kind of see the positivity in everything, even when it's not great. So again, that Pollyanna rule, well, it's got to rain, otherwise how do the flowers grow? Oh gosh, I'm going to be locked down with one person the rest of my life. You know, that's something a pessimist would say. So again, the idea is that even though on average we would think that these events are good or bad, there's a sense in which our kind of framing of these events kind of promotes stability in these psychological traits. Okay, so it doesn't depend on the stuff that happens to you. It doesn't depend on the historical context in which you're born, at least from the studies we looked at. So what does matter? And I'm going to tell you about 2 sources of variance that I think do matter. One is where you live, and the other is the people around you. And this will be kind of the rest of the talk, is trying to highlight those 2 sources of context predicting optimism. So one is that, like a lot of different psychological traits, optimism is regionally distributed. So this is data from the World Wellbeing Project. This is optimistic language in 181 million tweets plotted regionally. So the white spots are counties that they're too sparsely populated. They just don't have a lot of people. But you'll see that the redder regions are more optimistic. So remember I told you earlier that middle-aged and older adults tend to be more optimistic. If you look at the reddest parts of the map, you see that those are typically places that older adults retire to. So if you look at, say, the Southwestern United States, Florida, New England, which I don't usually associate with retirement communities. I live in Lansing, so it's this kind of yellow-orange spot here. So this is data from the World Wellbeing Project. People like Gregory Park and Johannes Eichstädt kind of lent me this data. But in true, if you kind of split it up a bunch of different ways, you'll see that optimists tend to cluster, originate, or move to places. So one in the top left corner here, this is about 50,000 people, optimism scores in the 50 US states. You know, you could look at a map like this and come up with, say, theories that are equivalent with, like, say, frontier migration, cultural psychology, that maybe the people who settled on the frontier are the people who are, say, more risk-taking, willing to kind of invest in this exploratory way. And then those optimistic people have optimistic children. And that's kind of why we see that people on the frontier are more optimistic. That would be a very reasonable description that would be consistent with a lot of, say, cultural psychology logic. In the bottom right corner, this is a really fascinating study. This is from the German socioeconomic panel. This is optimism in a bunch of different German districts over this 15-year period. One thing that you'll see in this particular graph, it's a little hard to see though, is that there's a demarcation line for where the Berlin Wall used to be. So the really interesting thing is that these data were collected from 1999 to 2014, but you'll still see the remnants of this historical event, namely when the Berlin Wall fell. I was raised in the American education system, so it was always phrased as this really amazing victory for capitalism and Western everything, and associated with the eventual fall of the Soviet Union. But there's a sense in which when the Berlin Wall fell, there was a lot of people in, say, East Germany, East Berlin, that really struggled with the transition to a new way of life. So imagine you're 60 years old and the Berlin Wall falls, and then there's this infusion of different, say, economic possibilities, job outlets, social conditions, the way people relate to each other, the way government relates to its people. So there's a sense in which, East Berlin and East Germany at least tended to struggle with kind of fully kind of migrating into this new world. And actually you'll see even years and years later, you'll see that there's this regional divide. It's not explained by how religious people were or a lot of the economic conditions. Like a lot of it is, anchored to where this line used to be that really defined people's psychological and life experiences. But the really interesting thing is that you'll see kind of geographic distribution, but then you'll look at relatively similar cultures and countries, or what I would say are relatively similar cultures, and you'll see that the aging experience really, really does differ, despite them having a lot of things that bode well for older adults, namely, say, a social safety net, retirement systems, relatively easy life or easier life in older adulthood. So these data are from a study called SHARE. It's about 20,000 people from 12 different countries. And you'll see that, again, not to invoke stereotypes, but I can't think of any immediate reasons why these countries would differ so much on their trajectories of age differences. Namely, some countries like Switzerland kind of increase, so it's all cross-sectional, so it kind of peaks in midlife before declining. Some places are relatively kind of decline throughout. Some are perfectly linear. Some are relatively stable and then declining. And this is kind of the mystery that we're struggling with now, is that, we'll see geographic differences, but then when you look at, say, how people change over time or the way their lifespan differs, you'll see that there are this kind of variability and we're not entirely sure. Yeah.
This is completely opposite. So what you describe for America.
Right. Yeah, the decline is faster. Yeah.
Well, Americans increase.
They increase, plateau, and then decline. Yeah.
Well, only after 68.
Right. Yeah. So these people are doing it when they're 60. So yeah. So they tend to be declining earlier. So it might be, American explanation where this kind of positivity kind of driving persists later into life, and then inevitably all the cultures experience this, or older adults everywhere maybe experience.
Many cultures are declining at age of 7.
Right. Yeah. Right. Even earlier in life. Yeah. So again, that's part of the mystery, is that, these are a lot of these are Western European cultures, which, often have some similarities with Americans, and you see that they're declining, and we don't know why. The next slide's even worse. So these are all of those German districts followed over time. My students call this the BARF graph for obvious reasons. And you'll see that there's just so much heterogeneity. And again, these are people who are maybe living only a few blocks away. And it looks like how their optimism changes over time differs really dramatically. So there's not a lot to take away from this graph, other than the fact that there is a lot of variability. And the key is to try to explain, where that variability is coming from. Maybe it has to do with individual characteristics. Maybe it has to do with something with the broader context that's shaping the aging experience. Okay, so that's the goal for this particular line of studies. And then another extension of it is that, context might affect whether optimism translates to better or worse outcomes as well. So, I've sold you the first 5 minutes of the talk that optimism is associated with, better professional success, better longevity. But there's a sense in which there might be contextual circumstances that might blunt the positive effects of optimism. So maybe if you don't have economic mobility or an ability to kind of seek out those opportunities, it doesn't matter how optimistic you are. And that's another way in which we can kind of seek why cultures differ and what their optimism looks like. So The last part of the talk I wanted to highlight is the role of close relationships. So we have health psychologists in the audience that just moved to Ann Arbor, kind of who are familiar with the impact of close relationships in health. Namely that a lot of people will cite it as something that gives their life meaning. Health and partners also affect our health decisions and behaviors. And one thing that I want to talk about is at least maybe to some degree, other people might affect the degree to which we're optimistic. So there is a sense in which when you look at close relationships and health, you can quantify the impact of close relationships on health relative to, say, other risk factors. So, across the top three here are the impact of social relationships on longevity. And you'll see that sometimes they're larger than a lot of, say, health behaviors that you would associate, like not smoking a ton, quitting smoking, not drinking a lot, getting vaccinated, going to, just exercising, physical activity, maintaining a healthy BMI, that's a relatively smaller effect size. I will also say that all of these aren't mutually exclusive either. So, the truth is if you have good relationships, you are probably doing a lot of healthier things anyway. So you're not binge drinking every single day or smoking a carton of cigarettes. But there is a sense in which when you look at, say, just raw effect sizes, the people with good close relationships or actually any relationships tend to fare better in terms of living longer. So the way people traditionally try to quantify the impact of relationships on health are via what's called an actor-partner interdependence model. The truth is it's just one way in which they try to do this. But what they do is they model non-independent data. So when you get, say, dyads, like people in a relationship, one of the problems is it violates the statistical assumption, namely that we assumed all the data points are independent of each other, but that's not true. These people are married. They probably share some history. So what they do is they model what are called actor effects, which are, say, the impact of your psychological traits on your outcomes. Like I told you, optimistic people live longer. That's an actor effect. But also partner effects, like a partner's characteristics on an individual outcome. So if I told you that, say, being married to an optimist is related to better health, that would be a partner effect. And the truth is we actually found that in a study where we got couples from the health and retirement study where both people filled out measures of optimism. And we tried to predict things like health, mobility, illness. And what we found is that controlling for the fact that you're, say, optimist or pessimist, being married to someone who is optimistic is good for your health. So just asking you how healthy you are, being married to an optimist is associated with better health. Fewer chronic illnesses, so things like heart attack, stroke over kind of an 8-year period. Better mobility, so running and jogging, bathing. It's also true for cognitive decline. So if you're married to an optimist, you are better at memory tests and less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. It's also true of individual optimism. So if you're optimistic, keep up the good work. But it's also a sense that this is kind of in addition to that. So it's this kind of additive effect where being married to an optimist is also good for you. But I just wasted the first 40 minutes of the talk talking about how optimism changes over time. And one issue with these particular models is that it assumes that these things are what are called time invariant, namely they're stable traits that you're predicting at one point in time to something in the future. But the truth is that optimism does change over time. It's related to how your health changes over time. So the main question with this latter part of the talk is whether or not it makes sense to treat them as time invariant, even though you know that they do change over time. Because there's a general sense that your relationships change over time too. So this particular magazine spread was sent to me where couples tried to recreate photos from early in the relationships. It's a very cute spread. So the really cool thing is they tried to replicate the photo exactly. So here they are cutting cake, same kind of hand gestures. Miraculously, they also were able to fit into the same clothes for a photo years and years later. So this was 1977 versus 2015, so pretty impressive. But by far, this is my favorite photo because I think especially the husband was able to replicate this kind of longing, loving look, looking to the future. It's a talk on optimism, looking into the future, full of great hope and love. And I hope that, the photos are really cute, but it kind of underscores this part in which relationships and the people in them do change over time, sometimes in dramatically different ways, sometimes through no fault of their own, because, when you're in a relationship with someone, you share a lot of things. You share kind of, you likely live together. raise children together, plan out your life goals together. But there's a ton of stuff that happens to you that your partner might not have influence on, like the fact that you go to work every day and interact with total strangers that are not your partner. Or sometimes the same event affects people in a relationship in different ways, where there's not consistency in how that kind of affects them. So in this last study, I kind of want to make some hypotheses that your actor and partner optimism, so you and your spouse's optimism, are associated with better health. I showed you that before. Changes in optimism are associated with changes in health for individuals. And then one interesting thing we tried to do with this study was to quantify whether seeing changes in your partner are related to better benefits for you. So if your spouse were to become more optimistic, is that a good thing for you, or is it sort of just a benefit for them? So what happened is we waited a few years until the health and retirement study collected more data. That's the really great thing with a lot of these data sets, is that the data kind of just get better over time. You kind of keep following these same people over time. So we had about 2,800 couples. Optimism and health are assessed at every wave. I'm running a little bit short on time. So one thing that I will tell you is that optimists tend to marry other optimists. So the correlation between two people is about 0.25. What that means also is that, yes, pessimists tend to marry other pessimists. So that is a phenomenon in literature. It's also true of a lot of different characteristics. So one thing we did, though, is we constructed this lagged analysis in which we try to predict, say, your optimism in the future from your optimism in the past, and also your health. So one thing we found is that optimism is relatively stable. So if your optimism one time point, 4 years later, you're very likely to also be more optimistic than a pessimist. But then we also found that that was true for people who are married to optimists as well. So again, over and above the fact that you're an optimist or a pessimist, being married to someone who was optimistic was associated with higher levels in your optimism 4 years later. And we also kind of tried to predict your changes from things like how sick you were, and then also how sick your partner was, which is this really fascinating consideration where when you're looking to the future, there's a sense in which maybe your spouse gets diagnosed with a terminal illness, or things are trending really poorly where you might not have a ton of time together left. It looks like your optimism is pretty resilient to that, so it's relatively stable. What matters more is the fact that they have this psychological trait. It's not necessarily that they're sick or you're worried about your own health. But there's a sense in which it kind of maybe kind of rubs off on you in some special way that we're not entirely sure what's happening. So the interesting thing is when you try to, say, predict people's optimism from their partner's optimism, you start to approximate that curve that I showed you earlier. And this is a different barf graph. My lab just makes fun of me for the bad graphs I make. But the idea is that kind of when you start to fill in where this variance is coming from, you start to see, oh, that's why people are changing. Part of it is stuff that they have to do with themselves. Part of it is things that the people that they're surrounding themselves with. So in terms of what we're trying to do next is we're trying to uncover the mechanisms for why being married to an optimist is good for you. So this is a version of an actor-partner interdependence model, but with a mediator. So it looks like a spaceship, but the idea is that if you're married to an optimist, maybe one reason why they're improving, say, your health, your cognition, is because they're motivating you to do healthier things, like, say, eat healthier or avoid riskier things. Maybe don't eat the cake, have a salad instead. Maybe go out for a walk instead of being sedentary. Maybe go to the doctor because you should catch it now. Maybe it'll turn out to be okay or be out nothing. Pessimists are less likely to kind of seek out that information. So the really interesting thing is that this was the idea, but we partially wrote a grant, and you should not do this, where we told the granting agency, we're not exactly sure how to analyze the data. So what we're going to do is we're going to do 2 different ways, which, again, don't do this. It's very risky. So if you're interested in methods at all, the thing on the left is more of a growth curve format. So the idea is that you have optimism, and it's associated with your average health and then how your health kind of changes over time. And maybe that's also explained in this lower figure by your health behavior. So, one reason why optimists have different health trajectories is because their physical health is also kind of changing or motivated. The one on the right resembles more of like a daily diary study where you have repeated measures of something. And you might say, well, maybe the link between better health behavior and health is positive, which we know that being healthier leads to better health. But maybe that's kind of stronger for people who are optimistic, where maybe that that's translating into better outcomes because they're willing to kind of engage it in the first place. So yeah, we pitched this to NIH, and then they gave us a grant to try to figure out how to analyze the data. And the goal is to kind of write a little bit of a primer or a tutorial for people who wanted to do the, forget about optimism for 2 seconds. Don't forget about it for 2 seconds. If you wanted to say model any sort of health-related phenomenon and the influence of other people, these are the types of things you'd want to learn how to do. And the goal is to kind of figure out a way to make it kind of accessible to people who want to do that. So, as I wrap up, we don't know why optimism changes. So I gave you a few ideas. Maybe it has to do with the circumstances in which you live, and that includes both, say, the local environment, but then maybe the people you surround yourself with. And the idea is that that's true for better or for worse. So you could surround yourself with tons of pessimists or tons of optimists. You could be born into a lot of different, wildly different circumstances. And the idea is that it kind of affects you in the way in which you think about the future. So I'd like to close with 2 of my favorite quotes about optimism. One is from Candide. So again, very, very old quote. What is optimism? It's the obstinacy of maintaining that everything is the best, even when it's the worst. And then James Branch Cabell said, the optimists think that this is the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist fears that that is true. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you for the talk. This is fantastic.
Thanks.
Have you explored any county level variables that might explain the variation in optimism, things like GDP or life expectancy?
Yeah, so that's one thing when I show you the Twitter data. That's one thing that they typically tend to do, where they'll link it to, say, county level rates of heart disease. So we've done that, and we found a positive link between those things. But in terms of explaining like the origins of optimism, there is an economic gradient, but it's actually not as large as you think. So, what that's saying is that there's tons of people across the socioeconomic spectrum that are optimistic. And the truth is, yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about life, other than, your exact socioeconomic circumstance. You can have positive relationships, you can have, so many other things. So, one thing is that we're still stuck a little bit in trying to model the outcomes of optimism, and less so about like where it's coming from. And I tried to give you 2 here, but basically with that Twitter data, you can do that. The HRS data is also geo-linked. So you can actually, in the very, very large study I showed you at the beginning, there's a sense in which you can get like a lot of fidelity with kind of geographic information, where 20 years ago, it would have been really, really hard to do, but now the data finally exists. So the answer is no, we haven't, but a little bit, so we hope to do.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So to me, American data made perfect sense, If you live long, you experience lots of bad things, and after all, you survived. So, I hear people say, for example, universities survived Reagan. So this time it's horrible, but probably it's okay. That's ultimate optimism, right?
Yeah.
So now, given that, this European data is so surprising. Basically optimism goes down in many countries. So this suggests to me that my naive interpretation of American data may not be right either. So what would you say?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the shared data are focused exclusively on older adults, and it could be that the explanation is partially true, where, maybe the Western European cultures are more elevated than, say, Eastern European cultures, for example, or East Germans. So maybe they kind of have a higher place to fall from. Kind of they have a starting value that's this, whereas
But
maybe
some countries are falling at the age of 30. That's ridiculous.
yeah, it is. So one thing is that there's a little bit of variability across studies. So that's in the shared data set, 20,000 people exclusively focused on older adults. The really, really large sample I started out with, we don't see as precipitous declines. So there's a sense in which like those are way more stable patterns, where a lot of the countries look really, really similar. Even in East European countries and East Asian cultures, they all kind of increase in optimism and reach a plateau. So yeah, there's maybe something going on there where it also violated my intuition. But then when I look at the larger data set of 4.5 million people, the trends are a little bit more stable. But the truth is, the shared data also has tons of information on like their health, everyday life, their thoughts about the future, where they grew up. Whereas the really large data set, you have almost no details on the people. So, you know, it could be that the large data set is good for describing the descriptive trends, and then the shared data will be good for really diving in. But yeah, I'm as confused as you are. Okay.
Thanks, Bill. This is awesome. I like your graphs too.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I'm saying. I don't know.
You took some time with it, but
Impressive.
Yeah. Okay, so loved all of it, but loved thinking about the role of a romantic partner. So gonna throw some questions at you. It's okay if you haven't done this, but one, are more optimistic people more likely to get married? So is there sort of a selection effect into marriage that might be affecting anything? And then, yeah, that was my first question. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, so there is a selection effect, and the really fun thing is the HRS, I don't know if I told Jackie this, but when you follow people over time, you actually get like second and third marriages. So one thing is you can see if they keep marrying the optimist over and over again, and the answer is they do.
Wow.
So not only is there selection, but that relationship goes south, and you still end up with a similar person.
Yeah.
And that's a dark, maybe that's a good or bad thing. I'm not gonna say that that's good or bad. But, you know, one thing about kind of longitudinal data is that, you know, you can kind of quantify a little bit of the selection versus socialization. So yeah, we find that there is socialization effects beyond just finding an optimistic partner, but there's also there's a sense in which people who decline in optimism are more likely to get divorced too, which is kind of a surprising thing I didn't mention. So as they become more and more pessimistic, their relationships suffer and they get divorced. And then they end up with another pessimist. So we have looked at selection effects, and then there's some, and those are big. That's and then the socialization ones are less. Any other questions?
I'll ask you later.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Or did you want to go first?
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So I also was struck by the discrepancy in the curves,
Yeah.
right? And one of the things I'm wondering about is you pointed out the cohort issue early on, and whether those European data are cross-sectional or whether they're longitudinal. Like, so does that give us any insight in answer to Shinhu's question? Like maybe there's something particularly depressing going on in Western Europe at the moment data. But then kind of more generally, a question about the measurement of optimism, like, because it's amazing that you've taken all of these different studies and big studies and pulled together a picture of what's going on. But presumably they all use slightly different operationalizations of optimism. Does that give us any insight into some of the maybe inconsistent results?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things working against me. So one is the measurement, one is the cohort issue with cross-sectional. The other is sampling, so that 4.5 million participant, that was done entirely online, and like, you know, I'm humble enough to admit that like there are these important selection effects when you do an online survey, especially of say, you know, lower socioeconomic countries. Like, well, who does have access to, you know, internet, and then who has the time to fill out an optimism measure? So there's a sense in which like the sampling is also at play, which we haven't talked about that yet. But so there's sampling, the measures differ, and the cohorts all differ. And the fact that you find any consistency is kind of comforting. But yeah, there's a sense in which the shared data set, they're filling out measures entirely about what it's like to be an older adult. And that's maybe just a different data collection context than, hey, here's a bunch of positive traits. That was the first study to answer questions about. So yeah, you know, I think like sampling variability in general is something that's really kind of not given enough attention, because I think that does explain a lot of variability across not just my type of studies, but a lot of different studies too. So yeah, the truth though is that it's a shame that there's not a lot of consensus on exactly what measure to use. Like the Q-sort measure was one that someone in the 90s kind of made up to maximize use of a measure that was never meant to measure optimism. So that's even more problematic. It's like this was never meant to measure optimism, but she sort of figured it out. So yeah, so any one of these things might explain it. I will say the share data and the HRS data use the same measure. So that, you know, that difference might not be entirely attributable to measurement, but it could be to sampling and it could be to cohorts. So That's the life orientation test. It's like a 6-item measure, kind of a Likert scale type thing. Yeah, so yeah, no, yeah, you're right on the nose. So there's a bunch of things kind of working against us and trying to build this kind of cohesive story. And that's why I said I don't know what's going on. So, yeah. Allie.
I'm trying to wrap my head around what optimism actually is here. And so I hope you can just play along with me for a second. I don't know if you have data to address this. Some of the things that some of the examples you used would suggest unrealistic optimism, right? So like, or optimistic bias. So people are making judgments that are more favorable than reality, right? And in that case, you may get something like the Dunning-Kruger effect being an optimistic bias, right? Is that sort of how you're thinking about optimism? Some of the questions were about sort of the connection with reality. So does SES predict optimism? So, or like, are people optimistic because they're having good outcomes? Are people optimistic in the faith, like regardless of the data? Is it an expectation? Is it in touch with reality? If it's not in touch with reality, why would you think it would be modulated by cultural relationships?
So
Those are like 25 questions.
Every of those 25 are crucial. So yeah, I mean, the truth is that historically, when you look at the vast majority of research, it'll be done on this kind of dispositional approach where there's these kind of attitudinal or perspective type items in certain times expected us. Sometimes they just ask like, how optimistic are you on a 1 to 7 scale? So there's a sense in which that doesn't necessarily make any inferences about what reality is. It's mainly kind of what your general disposition is. I will say that the unrealistic optimism, I start out by kind of saying that they'll ask you just before you're evaluated in some way, like before you get a medical diagnosis or a test for a college student, how well did you think you do? How well did you think you do? And then how well do you think you did? And then they'll compare it to how you actually did, and they'll subtract those two numbers. That's optimistic bias. There's also a sense in which they might ask a smoker, okay, you smoke 8 cigarettes a day, what's your risk of, say, lung cancer? And then there's actually a quantifiable way to kind of assess risk. Epidemiologists do it all the time based on how much you smoke and, say, your health history. So then they'll subtract those two numbers, and that's optimistic bias. And the truth is that, even experts can, misapply their risk perceptions, their personal risk perceptions. So, the truth is we're mostly working in this top area of disposition, but then those things that you mentioned are things that people look at. The shocking thing is that the correlation between those two things is only about like 0.18. So if you're saying, hey, I'm optimistic about the world, and then you actually look at, hey, are you bad at predicting stuff? The correlation's actually not that high. And I always found that was just really confusing. And maybe it has to do with numeracy, or Dave just saw an idea.
What do you make of that?
I don't know. I think the prediction judgments involve a lot of different things. It's really easy to ask, are you an optimistic person? And that's partially why we have such large samples. It's easy to do that. But in a way, like when you talk about the dangers of optimism, you're mostly talking about the mispredictions. So in a way, it's this kind of jingle thing where you're talking about a few different things, which is why I tried to lay it out here with a few different ways. But then the shocking thing, I didn't want to ruin the talk by telling you that they're not super highly correlated. So you tapped into a thing that we're really struggling with. Dave, do you have a thing?
Oh, no, it's just a comment. There's a big difference between a judgment and a judgment that carries accountability, a factual judgment. But the question I have, and it's sort of a odd follow-up to Allie's talk, you've been talking about optimism, but I like to play with things. And I like to think, what would this talk have been like if you had been talking about pessimism? Because I'm sort of interested in, are we really talking about optimism, or are we really talking about pessimism? That is, if you compare it to the mean or the median, is all the action on the bottom of the scale as opposed to the top of the scale? Or just conceptually, if you were talking about pessimism, how would you think differently about the phenomena that you're studying as opposed to talking about optimism as a conceptual variable?
Yeah, because then it flips the mechanistic language on its head, because all of a sudden, you're reducing negative perceptions about the world in light of life experiences. Whereas, I gave the positive valence spin all talk. So, that's certainly an interesting perspective that, yeah, you'd have to think really differently about these lifespan changes where this negativity bias goes away, not necessarily the positivity bias emerging. I will say that there is a group of researchers who think that optimism and pessimism aren't a unipolar scale. Yeah, and if you want to get nerdy for like 30 seconds, what they'll do is they'll model like a methods factor and like factor analysis, and they'll find that like the negative wordings of the items form a separate factor. So they're responding to the pessimism items differently than the optimism items. And some people think that that's a methodological point. Some people think that that's a substantive point, in which maybe these things could co-occur or you're neither. And I mentioned earlier about the domain specificity, where there are plenty of points in your life where you're probably optimistic about some stuff and pessimistic about other things. And then when I ask you these general statements about optimism and pessimism, that's where this kind of separation that happens. It's really hard to wrap your head around because I've lived my whole life thinking that optimists and pessimists are just the opposite ends of the spectrum, but methodologically it looks like they're not. And then the phrasing you just kind of portrayed it as suggests that they're separable.
Right.
And the problem is that people are struggling with how to say that in a smart way that people get it. But yeah, methodologically it looks like that's true. Yeah.
Great data sets. Wow, love it. So on the unrealistic optimism, I was reminded of Shelley Taylor's work on cancer that sort of brought up this, point of view that women with breast cancer say they're going to do better than they realistically likely would do. And that led to a lot of research and a lot of backlash, where kind of a whole literature maybe of some relevance. But I am interested in two other things, though. One is I kept struggling with the life event data because I do a lot of research on that, and most of that has shown that life events don't by themselves predict much in health. It has to be how they're perceived. And then you get into how do I perceive my stress? How do I perceive my optimism? Oh, what a mess. So I'm not sure what we do with that. But that led me to think about, has anyone looked at early adversity? Because we're finding such dramatic effects of early life adversity. And I wonder whether that lays a trajectory with respect to optimism that you mentioned.
Yeah, there has been early life adversity. And then one thing I didn't mention is that there's some heritability work as well that might explain why some people are more or less optimistic. So early life adversity is, negatively associated with it. Not at very large levels, though, you'd see. And sometimes there's a lot of adjacent characteristics to, so for example, there's this characteristic called John Henryism, which is sometimes associated with kind of early life adversity, where people try and achieve things at deleterious physical health costs. But there's a sense in which that is a little bit close to optimism because people try and strive for achievement and things like that. There's a sense in which, because kind of early adversity shapes a lot of different perspectives about the world, what's possible, how long you live, what's, the best of all possible worlds that you can think of. There is a sense in which that likely shapes it, but then of course adversity is distributed not randomly too, right? And that's why the geographic data is really useful, because you can kind of operationalize some of that adversity in both time and space. So what is it like in rural Oklahoma during this particular time in history that's different than, say, Brooklyn in 1993? These are the types of questions we can finally start to answer with these data. And then luckily, there are data sets like the health and retirement study that ask about the early life experiences, so you can start to fill in those gaps. Now that we know kind of how it changes on the other side of life, how we look into early experiences. The breast cancer literature too, that, it's controversial and there's backlash for a lot of reasons, including like the types of interventions people will engage in. That's what I'm familiar with. The truth is, it is positive characteristics. It predicts resilience, but then there is this really delicate and precarious when it comes to individual healthcare decisions, where you kind of have to be really careful about, being too prescriptive. Do you have another follow-up?
You just raised the issue that, all social psychologists would think about. You've got this wonderful cross-sectional data, same stuff I do to study health. Does anybody look at it experimentally? And what can we add to the picture if you look at it at different ages in the lab?
Yeah, and manipulate it, and concept age. Yes, that's a bit controversial. So there's some work on Penn where they developed this series of intervention techniques that I don't think have really stood up the test of time. The truth is, when you look at those interventions, a lot of them closely resemble cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's an intervention, but it's really just going to therapy.
I actually was thinking more about the behavioral compounds that come up. So if you take optimists and less optimistic people into the lab at different ages, do they behave really differently in terms of all kinds of tasks and behaviors that you might study? That was what I was.
Yeah, there's a sense in which it might be variant across age with the way it's manifested.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, we only look at scale items, but nobody's done the behavioral stuff.
Just as a side note, if you are defining it as an expectation, I usually expect the best, you can absolutely manipulate that in the lab.
Sure. Yeah, and it's expectation that it's more easy to move around than entire mindsets. Sorry.
So this kind of builds on, I think, Ali and Dave's earlier question about pessimism and optimism. You said something at some point in the talk that made me wonder whether positive affect is necessary for optimism.
Okay.
And in the sense that, at the moment, right, there might be folks having a range of feelings about the future, right? And some of those people might be very positive about things. Others might be quite negative about things. Does that necessarily mean optimism versus pessimism?
Yeah, not necessarily. The technical definition I tried to give earlier was just, can you identify positive experiences? That doesn't mean do you have to co-experience them, do you have to be over the moon? It's just, can you distinguish between positive and negative things? And then expect more of that, which is a cognitive estimation of frequency. So when you look at correlates of, say, positive affect, depression is often looked at, which I know is a different characteristic. You'll see that they're not entirely collinear, which means that there are tons of people who are saying they're optimistic who are very depressed, or they're saying they're optimistic, but they're not experiencing exuberant positive affect all the time. And it is a bit it's possibly correlated, so they do co-occur, but they don't co-occur at such high levels to suggest that they are necessary and sufficient. So the answer to your question empirically is no. But then, conceptually, if you were to describe an optimist, you sometimes invoke positive affect in a way that it doesn't necessarily jive with the way they're actually filling these scales out.
Right. And so I guess that was where I was going, was are some of the ways that we ask about, are you an optimist?
Yeah.
Getting at people's lay theories of what optimism is,
Possibly.
as opposed to the actual driving factor that has the benefit, which is probably more the control and CBT part.
Yeah, so let's strip it entirely positive question. Do you think you can exert control over your environment to bring about future positive? I struggle to do it.
And now you've got a different construct.
Right. Yeah, and then previous research is kind of, what do we do with that?
That's mastery. You said mastery
Yeah.
before. That's a mastery.
That's mastery. But you can bring about terrible things too. Yeah, Dave.
Oh, yeah, well, I have it here. Just want to get your opinion on something. You mentioned that dispositional optimism is correlated with health and health behaviors. No denying that, but I'm wondering if it isn't necessarily that optimism is correlated with positive stuff, it's just correlated with more stuff. And if you look at the positive realm, you'll see more activity and positive stuff. And if you look at a negative realm, you'll see more stuff there. Because unrealistic optimism is correlated with gambling debt. And I presume if you looked at other forms of health, like athletic injuries, risky behavior, death, premature death, you'd find unrealistic optimism there, I'm betting. So that optimism is correlated with more, positively balanced and negatively balanced. And fueling that as well is that failure is bad luck, and people don't understand just how much success is good luck. Coming from the judgment decision-making world, it's amazing how much success is luck. And I want to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, and when you look at the attributions that optimists make, they'll attribute the positive stuff to internal characteristics and the failures to external ones. So, one thing that life events were mentioned earlier, there are new ways of characterizing life events in terms of these qualitative dimensions. And we've done a study where we try to look at how do optimists and pessimists perceive these life events differently. And optimists think they have control over the positive stuff. Pessimists think that they have no control over anything. A lot of it, some people think it'll ruin their social life. Like there's a lot of different dimensions you can look at. So the one thing that I'll push back on the just being associated with more stuff is that it is associated with bad stuff. So it's not necessarily valence neutral. I will say one thing that wasn't on the slide about a bunch of different measures is that another way that people look at unrealistic optimism is via curvilinear effects, where maybe like optimism is good to a certain extent, but then if you're kind of deliriously optimistic, that's when you see all these risk-taking events and pursuing stuff to no end, even though you know it's going to fail. And those results have been actually pretty underwhelming. So it looks like there's linear effects where it's pretty beneficial. That aforementioned one that split up the scale into positive and negative, they actually did that with optimism and pessimism. And for the most part, most of the stuff was linear. So that was by far characterizing most of the outcomes. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to see because when you see people taking a lot of risks, there is an inherent optimism where somewhere in their mind they think that it's going to work out. And that is maybe optimism as well. Yeah.
You don't want to ask,
No, you're good.
want me to ask you later?
No, yeah, we have 4 minutes left, so.
Why are you not taking a meta-analysis that Shire and a million authors did that showed the optimism and pessimism items on the lot to be differential?
Yeah.
Why, that's opened up a whole avenues of research with data that you might have.
Yeah, so that's actually the aforementioned paper, it's an
Yeah.
American Psychologist article.
I'm one of the co-authors.
Thank you for, so actually that three culture study of life events, we did split it up into optimism and pessimism, and the life events didn't affect either scale. I will say that that's not without controversy. We can talk about this a little bit later and get into it. But the behavioral genetics people will say that, one reason, there's no pessimism items that are positively balanced, and that's a methodological problem. So you never ask about pessimism, are you a pessimist? That's not an item in the law.
Right.
It's more like, I'm blanking on the items right now, but there's a sense in which there is a methods factor that the Shire paper hasn't adequately considered. The problem is that that measure is used so much that the optimism and pessimism items are baked into how the items are scored. And I think you need a different optimism measure that mixes the valence to really separate the two. So that measurement paper doesn't exist right now. So the Shire paper is really useful, and honestly, method effects are really interesting because if you respond negatively to every single item I ever give you, that tells me something important psychologically about you. Not the fact that you're just pessimistic, but I think with all due respect, the Shire paper hasn't quite.
Well, the test is kind of, will those two different subsets of items and maybe a better, longer measure that does a better job predict health differentially? And I think there's evidence thus far that they might, and so that's why I brought it up.
Everything you said is true, but it'd be nice to have a more diverse measure.
Sounds like you have work ahead.
So much. Well, thanks so much again. It was really wonderful seeing all of you. Thanks again.